Hello, and welcome to the Homegrown Fuels podcast, sharing stories of ethanol's emergence in rural America. I'm your host, Sue Retka Schill, a biofuels journalist, now retired from full-time work, but still writing about ethanol and other biofuels. There are so many good stories out there about the early days of the ethanol movement that ought to be recorded before they're lost. Writing a book takes a lot of time and resources, but I love talking to people and people love telling their story. So the idea for this podcast was born. Thanks to BBI International and Ethanol Producer Magazine for producing this podcast. If you'd like to sponsor the podcast or give some feedback, contact us at homegrownfuels@bbiinternational.com. Our guest today is Jeff Fowler, who led the ethanol enzyme sales team at Novozymes, now Novonesis, for around 2 decades. Jeff was studying microbiology at South Dakota State University, where he worked at a fuel ethanol pilot plant from 1978 to 1980 and went on to become the microbiologist at a small Act 80 ethanol demonstration plant. After that, he started in ethanol enzyme sales, working for Miles, Inc. Jeff, welcome to the Homegrown Fuels podcast. I love learning from folks whose experience goes back as far as 1978. Tell us about the SDSU fuel ethanol plant.
Well, thank you, Sue. It's great to talk to you again. And I really appreciate that you're doing the Homegrown Fuels podcast. I think that is a great service to the industry. Yeah, going back to the ethanol facility at South Dakota State University, that was quite an experience. Dr. Paul Middaugh was the professor there, and he had the vision to, in his mind, it was the vision to have basically a still on every farm and power farm equipment. Now, that never really came to fruition, but he did get a fuel ethanol pilot plant established at South Dakota State University. Demolished the old stalls that were in this animal housing unit to helping install the equipment to running the pilot plant, making mash, giving tours of hundreds and hundreds of farmers and investors who back in those days had interest in the fuel ethanol industry. It was really, really an exciting time back then.
I recently interviewed Bill Gibbons for a Homegrown Fuels podcast. He was working with you at that plant. He provided a lot of details about that pilot plant, but I understand you have a few stories about Bill.
Well, some of them he may not appreciate, but I'll tell them anyway. Now, I consider Bill a really good friend. I worked with him as an undergraduate student at South Dakota State University, and I always referred to him as Gunner Bill because he was an A student and was studying, and so that term of gunner always went along with people who were always gunning it to get good grades. He certainly did that. And Bill was a backup center on the South Dakota State basketball team, so he's very tall. And one of the stories about Bill was we had these old dairy processing tanks that we used to cook mash. And I don't recall the exact malfunction that happened, whether it was a motor or the impeller. But anyway, it had mash in it, and we needed to get it out. So Bill just stripped down to his underwear, climbed into the tank, and was kicking the mash out the opening of the tank. So if you could imagine a guy 6'8" who's mostly in the tank, but a lot of him's out of the tank, kicking mash out of it. Bill Gibbons, but great guy, and respect him highly.
You also worked with Dennis Vandegreen and Paul Whalen. What was that like?
That was very interesting. Dennis is the one that actually built the still that was used at South Dakota State University. His brother, Dave Vandegreen, back in Sheldon, Iowa, basically did welding and manufacturing of tanks and honey wagons for manure spreaders. So Dennis envisioned what the still was going to be. Dave then did the fabrication of it. And, back then, Dennis was not a student anymore. He had left the university at that point. Paul Whalen was a graduate student in microbiology, and he was studying to get his master's degree. And so the two of them really were the pair that were more or less running the facility and determining what kind of research work was going to be done there at the time. So what then transpired was they formed a consulting partnership. I continued to work for the first semester going towards my graduate degree. But Dr. Middaugh left, went to work in the industry, making 3 times what he was making as a college professor. So there was no professor to lead the research work, and I knew it was going to take me quite a few years to finish without a professor there to do a thesis on. So I went to work for Paul and Dennis with Wayland Vandergren Consulting. So Wayland Vandergren Consulting, at that time, they did a lot of work with the very small ethanol plants that were out there. And part of my job was to essentially design small laboratories for them. And then during this time was also the beginnings of the design and fabrication of the Act 80 ethanol plant in Sheldon, Iowa. That plant was owned by the Vandergren family and Paul Wayland, one of the grad students. So once that was up in enough operation that the lab was open, I did a lot of the basic R&D type of work that was necessary to get the plant running. That plant was pretty sophisticated at the time for a little ethanol plant. The lab was far better than probably 95% of the ethanol plants that were out there. The design of the plant was that it was to be a cascading continuous fermentation plant, meaning that mash would be cooked, it would go into a saccharification tank where it would generate sugars. Then it would go into the first tank where the fermentation process would begin, and it would cascade over into 3 subsequent tanks and then go to distillation. To make that process run, we had to essentially research what were the kinetics, the fermentation kinetics that would drive the fermentation and drive the propagation tank that was there.
That sounds pretty sophisticated. Fermentation kinetics, can you explain that a little more?
Sure. So the fermentation kinetics is the rate at which the yeast is going to convert the sugars into ethanol and also gobble up the sugar that's there. So one of the experiments that's kind of burned into my memory bank was we needed to run this test where I would propagate yeast from a single cell. We would grow it up in the lab, and then I would run a test to determine how quickly we were going to be producing ethanol based on the mash that we were going to have. That test, because the propagation process beginning in fermentation was going to last about 36 hours, that meant that I had to be on site for 36 hours. So I brought my sleeping bag to the lab, thinking I was going to get some sleep, which I didn't. And so as the experiment continued on, I then would have to pull samples and run HPLC tests to determine the amount of sugar that was there, the amount of ethanol that was being produced, and a bunch of other tests at the same time. And it turned out that that test ran for 36 hours. So counting the prep time and all of that, I'm sure I was on site for over 40 hours without any sleep, which once I left the facility and got in my car, I had to actually just stop and think about which town am I in and what are the directions to my apartment, because I was so sleep deprived, I had no idea where I was going.
Yeah, I hear you have a story about Dennis too in those days at Act 80. He was kind of a character, but also a hardworking fellow, I understand.
Dennis was brilliant. He was a very smart guy. He was extremely hardworking. I think for people that know him, he had a very strong personality. And I recall being in the lab, which was on the second floor of the Act 80 facility. There were 3 windows. One looked out over the fermentation deck. One looked straight ahead into the distillation area. And then one looked out over the centrifuges. And I'm working there one day, and all of a sudden I see this extension ladder going up, 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 until it hits the top of the distillation column. And I'm wondering, what in the heck is going up? Well, pretty soon I see Dennis climbing the rungs of the ladder, coming up to the top of the distillation column, lit cigarette in his mouth while distillation is running. And I'm thinking to myself, I am just about ready to become a missile launched into the air, because that is not the best thing to do. But that was pretty typical of Dennis. Cigarette was usually in his mouth, and there usually was about 3 inches of ashes that somehow managed to stay on that cigarette.
Yeah. What kind of person was Paul Whelan to work with?
Paul was absolutely brilliant as well. And Paul is a guy that I took most of my direction from, because I was working in the lab and was a microbiologist by training, and that's what Paul was responsible for in the facility, was making sure that the fermentations all ran correctly. He was the sort of guy that was just relentless in his pursuit of researching. And, you got to remember, back in these days, there were no laptops. There was no internet connections. There was no alcohol textbook out there that you could refer to. So these went from ideas and concepts to Paul researching in the Briggs Library at SDSU and really digging in to find out answers. And I recall there was an article that he uncovered. It was a Russian article that was on from a distillation operation, manufacturing ethanol. So in the summary of it in English, he could tell there was something in there he was interested in. So we ordered the article. The article came in, and we happened to have a young lady in our microbiology lab, a lab assistant by the name of Galina. Galina was from Russia. So Paul gave her the article. She translated it into English, and lo and behold, that article was very important in how Paul was designing the saccharification system and fermentation system for the Act 80 plant. So he was really relentless in his pursuit of the knowledge that was necessary to make a successful operation.
Wow. So Act 80, I understand, didn't last too long for reasons. It was small, and they couldn't make money because small-scale ethanol plants couldn't make any money. So you went on to work as an enzyme salesman. Tell us a little bit about that transition and what you learned.
Yeah, so actually Miles, was watching the ethanol industry blossom. And we actually used their enzymes in the plant. And so I had met some of their representatives previously. And once Act 80 basically had failed, then I went to work for Miles. They hired me specifically because they wanted someone who knew something about how to manufacture ethanol. So I went to work for them. And that was very interesting because while I didn't solely call on the ethanol industry, it definitely was the dominant thing that I did. And so I called on a lot of 1 million gallon a year plants, 3 to 5 million gallon a year plants. And then I also called on ADM in Cedar Rapids. So I kind of had the spectrum of the industry that I called on, but by and large, from a numbers standpoint, certainly there were many, many more small ethanol plants that were out there, and those are the ones that I spent a lot of time calling on.
What were those ethanol plants like? And do you remember who some of them were?
Wow. Yeah, there are some memories from that point in time. Some of those ethanol plants, I recall meeting a a fiery young guy by the name of Bugs Graham, which many of our listeners probably will know from his days of both being in the industry with ethanol technology and then also operating ethanol plants. He was at Grain Power Tucumcari in Tucumcari, New Mexico. That's where I first met Bugs and loved the man dearly. Ron Autry was at Autry Enterprises in New Mexico. Kelly Davis was at CVEC. There were plants called ADC1 and ADC2 originally, which eventually became Chief Ethanol and Manildra. Manildra didn't last all that long, but Chief obviously continued to expand and grow over the years. Dwayne Christensen was there. Roger Birkin was there. Roger would always quiz me to death when I came in there. It was really a test to see how much I knew, what was I saying and could I back it up with experience and knowledge. So those were some of the folks. AGP in Hastings was there. Russ Zeke was, over there. So quite a few people who remained in the industry for a lot of years and was really pretty interesting time. So many of those plants were absolutely filthy. I went into those small plants. Bugs got it. He understood the importance of proper sanitation and the fact that the yeast were trying to outcompete contaminating bacteria. So he really understood that and ran a good plant. But there were some plants out there that were just really filthy, and they were so bad you could literally smell the sour smell of the mash when you just drive up to the facility. So I sold a lot of enzymes by basically starting at square one and showing the people in the plant how to clean the plant, why they needed to clean the plant. And once they did that, they're like, wow, we haven't ever had ethanol yields this high. Then once you get a clean plant, you can do a better job of optimizing the enzymes and the yeast too.
Yeah, right. You left Miles in 1988, and then you got back into the industry several years later. When was that?
Yeah, in 1999, what was then Novo Nordisk and then a year later became Novozymes. They had a gentleman retiring who had called on the ethanol industry, and one of the colleagues there, Bob Hamburger, remembered me from the Miles days. And so he called me up, told me about the opening. I went to work for them thinking I was going to run a territory calling on pet food manufacturers, baking, a lot of fuel ethanol right around the Kansas City area where I live. And actually the day before I officially started, they said, hey, we've had a bit of a setback in the detergent industry. We need to fill that sales gap. What would you think about the next 6 months just working in ethanol? I'm like, that's easy. That's my background. That's my strength. That's where I can contribute the most. And 6 months came and went, and 25 years later, I was still involved with the ethanol industry.
The long career.
Yeah.
When did you step out of your sales director role, and what did you do after that?
So I spent about 16 years leading the fuel ethanol sales team. And then once I stepped out of that role, I was involved in training and development of our people, along with still covering a few accounts during that time.
All right. So is there anything that stands out in your memory of the ethanol industry?
Well, one of the things that stands out to me is a concept that I didn't really know about until a number of years ago, called the founder's mentality. And I think for those of you that aren't familiar with it, I would encourage you to Google it and find some YouTube videos on it and take a look at it. That was something that really struck a chord with me about the ethanol industry and a few of the people that are in it.
So what is the founder's mentality, and how does it apply to the ethanol industry?
So the founder's mentality is a mentality that drives a lot of successful companies that go from pretty much startup to establishing a business. And in the founder's mentality, there's a strong sense of ownership, and I don't mean ownership like financial ownership. I mean, I own the business. I own the people. I'm going to be successful. I'm going to be a champion in what I do. And often it involves innovating and being able to move quicker, faster, better than your competition. And so I think when I look around the ethanol industry, there are certainly people that I believe fall into that founder's mentality. Examples would be Dave and Dennis Vandergren. Dave is always asked to speak at industry events, always give his outlooks, his views, sometimes his not so popular views on things. Dennis certainly had the passion, the drive to make sure that he was successful, that Dave was successful, that all of the people at ICM were successful with the engineering designs and the troubleshooting that went along with that. I'd look at Jeff Broin. Certainly the Broin brothers that formed that business had a vision of what they wanted to do, but then Jeff took it a step further, and it's a completely different business model than, say, the ICM business model. But it's a very successful business model. And again, Jeff is asked to speak at industry events. He champions different causes. He is a believer in this industry and a big proponent. And I give Steve Lewis a tremendous amount of credit there too. Steve's a genius, and he brought to the Broin organization, now Poet, not only his technical knowledge and his experience working with enzymes and yeast, but he also brought a passion that he wanted to see that business succeed. He continued to bring innovation, new ideas, new thoughts to their operation. And so I look at people like Dave and Dennis and Jeff and Steve as really having this founder's mentality that drives this industry, that people follow, that people want to emulate a lot of the things that they do. So that's what I mean by the founder's mentality, and that's one of the lasting memories that I certainly have of how that industry has gone from infancy to maturity. I won't say it's fully mature yet, because I certainly hope there's many, many more years of growth and expansion that this industry grows. But these people have driven a lot of the success of the industry, technically, engineering-wise, politically, you name it, they've been there.
That is true. That is true. In this philosophy, is there a way that, like the new coming generation coming in, can they adopt the same founder's mentality to that degree?
Yes and no. I think there are plenty of people who join companies in the ethanol industry, whether it's a Broin, and Novozymes, now Novonesis, and ICM, who are looking for a job. And those that treat it as just a job aren't going to bring that kind of mentality to it. Those that come and want to make a difference, those who come and see a problem that they want to overcome, and they want to take ownership to make sure that problem gets taken care of, that opportunity gets explored. I think those people can be a founder in their own way.
Good point. Good point. And I think that's a good place to end our conversation. I really appreciate you taking the time today, Jeff, to visit with all of us, and wish you well in retirement. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Sue. My pleasure, and it's always nice reminiscing about the ethanol industry. I love the industry and the people that I've worked with, both at Novozymes, but also so many customers that I've interacted with over the years.
Yes, and I'm hoping these podcasts, these stories that people are telling, help to inspire the next generation. Thanks again. Thanks to Ethanol Producer Magazine for sponsoring this episode of the Homegrown Fuels podcast. Ethanol Producer Magazine is the #1 source for ethanol industry news, trends, and statistics. Through the print magazine and website, ethanolproducer.com, the editorial team delivers daily news and industry features to an audience of producers, service providers, and vendors. If you would like to sponsor a future episode of Homegrown Fuels, contact service@bbiinternational.com. And if you have a comment on an episode or know of a story that ought to be shared, email homegrownfuels@bbiinternational.com. This podcast was recorded and edited by Danielle Pekarski, Content Manager at BBI International, and I'm your host, Sue Retka Schill. Thank you for listening. We'll be back in a couple of weeks with another episode of Homegrown Fuels, sharing stories of ethanol's emergence in rural America.